I'm live. Hi, thanks for joining me. And my name is Patti Napolitano, owner and operator of Wellness Cleveland, and Professor Patti. This semester I'm teaching Social Work 626, Advanced Generalist Practice with Communities. And I'm sharing today, reading aloud one of our week 3 articles. This is by Lorraine M. Gutierrez and Edith A. Lewis. It is chapter 13 from a textbook that's edited by Meredith Minkler. It's the second edition of Community Organizing and Community Building for Health. So chapter 13, it says it's 17 pages long, but really we have like two title pages at the beginning and at least a page and a half, I think 2.5 pages of citations at the end. So it's like a short one. So chapter 13, Education, Participation, and Capacity Building in Community Organizing with Women of Color. The field of community organizing has only recently begun to address the need for an approach to practice that respects health and builds on the special challenges posed by our increasingly diverse society. Although much community organizing has taken place among women in communities of color, for example, surprisingly little attention has been paid to the ways in which race, gender, ethnicity, or social class will affect the organizing effort. This oversight has often prevented organizers from working effectively with women or communities of color. Citation Bradshaw et al., 1994, Burghardt, 1982, Rivera and Ehrlich, 1995. By failing to recognize and take into account the many ways in which issues of oppression affect organizing work, organizers can perpetuate the objectification and exploitation of these groups. Burghardt, 1982. Organizers whose own racial or ethnic stereotypes distort their view of communities of color, for example, will be ineffective in building leadership or working in partnership. Bradshaw et al., 1994, Rivera and Ehrlich, 1995. In this way, community organizing efforts can perpetuate the very problems they were designed to solve. This chapter begins by examining several recent contributions to our thinking about organizing with women of color, with special attention to the contributions of feminist perspectives on organizing. An empowerment framework stressing education, participation, and capacity building is then developed and used to explore different dimensions of effective community organizing with women of color. Examples of organizing both within and across racial ethical groups, illustrate many of the points made and offer lessons for social change professionals in their roles as organizers. Multicultural perspectives on community organizing. Much of the literature that does exist on multicultural organizing emphasizes the ways in which organizers can develop cultural competence for working in partnership with communities. In particular, this literature has stressed the ways which organizers can use their own self-awareness to build bridges for work within communities. Organizers are encouraged to take the role of the learner in approaching a community and discovering its problems and strengths. Burghardt, 1982, Bradshaw et al., 1994, Rivera and Ehrlich, 1995. A critical contribution to organizing with communities of color may be found in Felix Rivera and John Ehrlich's 1995 approach to identifying the appropriate roles for the organizer in light of his or her relationship to the community. If the organizer is a member of the community, these analysts argue, then primary contact is appropriate. Primary contact involves immediate and personal grassroots work with the community. In contrast, an organizer who has a similar ethnic or racial background but is not part of the community should instead be involved on the secondary level. This level involves participation as a liaison between the community and the larger society. The tertiary level of contact is most appropriate for those who are not members of the group. They can provide valuable contributions to the community through consultation and the sharing of technical knowledge. For example, outside professionals interested in participating in community work with a local African American neighborhood could first establish relationships with key individuals in the community. The professional as organizers' responsibilities would be those defined by the community, no matter how insignificant those tasks might seem on the surface. Efforts to learn the strengths of the community as they are exemplified in daily learning activities within the community would be a primary activity for the organizer. In this way, residents would in time recognize the organizer's willingness to use the culturally competent perspective of non-interference, and more opportunities for work with that community might be revealed. In work on organizing with communities of color, Catherine Bradshaw, Stephen Seufer, and Lorraine Gutierrez, 1994, propose a hybrid model of organizing that integrates aspects of Saul Alinsky's 1972 approach to social action organizing with relevant perspectives from feminist organizing. Flexibility, leadership identification and training, the appropriate use of both collaborative and confrontational tactics, and the role of the organizer as a learner and facilitator are among the characteristics of this hybrid model. Of particular importance in this model are skills for developing cultural competence that enable the outside organizer to better understand, respect, and learn from the community. These skills involve 1. Cultivating awareness of one's own understanding of the community. 2. Finding ways to learn more about the local community through key informants. 3. Working as partners to develop local leadership. And 4. Focusing on ways to build cohesiveness within and between ethnic communities. As is by now clear, the most critical role of the organizer is that of a learner who approaches the community to understand and facilitate change. Contributions from feminism. Much of the conceptual and practice-based literature on organizing with women has been written from a feminist perspective. Gutierrez and Lewis, 1995, Hyde, 1986, 1994, Weil, 1995. Feminist approaches can contribute to organizing with women of color because they emphasize integrating personal and political issues through dialogue. Feminist organizing assumes that sexism is a significant force in the experiences of all women and one that lies at the root of many of the problems they face. Therefore, a major focus for organizing with women of color is to identify ways in which sexism, racism, and other forms of oppression are affecting their lives. Bricker, Jenkins, and Heumann, 1986, Gould, 1987, Hyde, 1986, 1994, Faulkner and Capacity, 1988, Morell, 1987, Zavella, 1986. Common methods for feminist organizing include the development of consciousness-raising groups, creation of alternative services, and social action that incorporates street theater and other holistic methods. So this is the perfect segue into my aside on this article, which I don't always have, but I do have them. So to understand the role of sexism in our thinking, we can think about, I'm going to tell you a riddle. A man and his son are driving on the freeway and they're in a terrible accident. And the life flight has to come for the son. And the father drives to the hospital behind the son and dies on the way. So he never gets there. So the son arrives at the hospital and is greeted by the surgeon, who immediately says, "I can't operate. That's my son." So if you can solve this riddle and understand how this can be logical, it's embarrassing how hard people think about it. And if you know it already, then you already know it. And maybe you have a line of thinking where you just figured it out. Some people go to, the kid must have two dads, or is there a space-time continuum? And we come up with all of these exceptional ways to answer the riddle, when the simplest answer is the surgeon is the child's mother. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about ideas of sexism that interfere, is there's things that we just don't even consider for women or for people of color, and they don't exist in our mind because we have not seen it or seen it represented often enough. We see it represented as the exception. How do we know a movie set about the future there's a black president or a woman president, right? I have to get back to the window where my article is. I love asides, don't you? All right. So that was my street theater research. An important focus of feminist approaches is reflected in their concern about developing ways to work across differences. All women are thought to be a part of a community of women as well as members of their own specific communities. This is intersectionality. That's what we're talking about. All women are thought to be a part of a community of women as well as members of their own specific communities. Therefore, organizers need to work to bridge differences between women based on factors such as race, class, physical ability, and sexual orientation on the principle that diversity is strength. According to this perspective, quotations, feminist practitioners will not only strive to eliminate racism, classism, heterosexism, anti-Semitism, ableism, and other systems of oppression and exploitation, but will affirm the need for diversity by actively reaching out to achieve it. End quote. Bricker, Jenkins, and Hueyman, 1986. This goal for feminist organizing has been most effective when carried out from a multicultural perspective. Gutierrez and Lewis, 1994. Organizing with women of color. Very little literature has looked specifically at methods for organizing women of color. Yet, as we have discussed elsewhere, Gutierrez and Lewis, 1994 and 1995, organizing by women within ethnic communities in the United States has a rich and diverse history. For example, a century ago, leaders such as Ida B. Wells Barnett organized the Black Women's Clubs, which were instrumental in developing nursing homes, daycare centers, and orphanages in African American communities. These clubs also organized for social change, particularly on anti-lynching and anti-rape campaigns, and in the foundation of organizations such as the National Urban League. Collins, 2000, Gutierrez and Lewis, 1995, Mockton Quam, 1986, Smith, 1986. Women of color have always worked to improve conditions within their communities and in society in general, and have been more likely than European American middle-class women to see community activism as a natural outgrowth of their gender role. Acklesberg and Diamond, 1986, Gilkes, 1980. During the mid to late 20th century, for example, women played important roles in the movement for equality and civil rights in the ethnic minority communities. Evans, 1980, Munoz, 1989, West, 1990, Wythorn, 1984. What's missing from this, women of color being more likely to work in their communities, what's missing from this is that white middle-class women excluded women of color from feminist policies, from feminist spaces, and from feminist movements in America and abroad. Neighborhood violence, economic issues, and environmental concerns are just a few of the areas on which women of color in urban communities have organized. Fighting Back, 1988, Hirsch, 1991, Mothers Group, 1989. Effective community organizing efforts will build upon these traditions. By looking at these historical and contemporary efforts, we can identify ways to draw upon their strengths and learn from and adapt the strategies that already exist. As already noted, The role of the organizer can and should vary according to her relationship to the community or the issue being addressed. Rivera and Ehrlich, 1995. To determine the appropriate role, we must involve the community in defining the issues it wishes to address and the strategies it feels will be most effective and culturally appropriate in attempting to achieve collectively set goals. For example, a Native American woman may be able to use her role as a member of the community and a designated leader to work on the primary level with her community to bring about change. A very different role in relation to the community would be taken by a Latina or Japanese American organizer who could provide important technical assistance or research skills, but would not work on this primary level. Although we emphasize the necessity of participation by community members in primary roles, the important roles that can be played by non-members of the community on the secondary and tertiary levels should not be overlooked. Education, participation, and capacity building. What does this analysis suggest about community organizing with women of color? Using an empowerment framework that stresses the core concepts of education, participation, and capacity building, we can develop sensitive and effective methods for community practice. Many of the methods described here are equally relevant to organizers and community members, and the processes of education, participation, and capacity building should take place within the organizer as well as with community members. These reciprocal process methods can be summarized as follows. Education. 1. Learn about, understand, and participate in the women's ethnic community. 2. Recognize and build upon ways in which women of color have worked effectively within their own communities. Build upon existing structures. 3. Serve as a facilitator and view the situation through the lens or vision of women of color. Participation. 4. Use the process of praxis to understand historical, political, and social context of the organizing effort. 5. Begin with the formation of small groups. 6. Recognize and embrace the conflict that characterizes cross-cultural work. Capacity building. 7. Involve women of color in leadership roles. 8. Understand and support the need that women of color may have for their own separate programs and organizations. Education. This is a subheading. Educational efforts toward community organizing and change need to be grounded in the ways in which women of color share similarities and differences with European American women and men of color. Community organizers have often recognized the impact of powerlessness on women of color who are suffering under institutional racism. Frequently overlooked in this process, however, is the role of gender inequity in influencing the life chances of women of color. The history of community participation by women of color has often been ignored by the field. When women of color are viewed solely as members of their racial or ethnic group and gender is not taken into account, community organizers may alienate women of color and reinforce ways in which sexism, both in larger society and within the ethnic minority communities, is a form of oppression. Aragon de Valdez, 1980, Collins, 2000, Weil, 1995, Zavella, 1986. As suggested in previous chapters, an important first step in effective community organizing involves defining community. The fact that women of color can be members of multiple communities and hold multiple identities based on race, gender, geography, and other factors presents both a challenge and an opportunity for organizers. From an organizing perspective, however, the central issue for organizing often defines the community. For example, if the issue is toxic waste dumping in a community, then the neighborhood or city may be an appropriate level for work. If the issue is sterilization abuse and reproductive rights, then gender may be the focus. Awareness of these memberships in multiple communities can be helpful when an organizer is building coalitions or alliances among different groups. An organizer who is from a different racial, ethnic, or class background than the women she works must recognize how her life experience has colored her perceptions and how her status has affected her power relative to the political structure. Her beliefs and perceptions should not dominate the organizing effort. She must work towards serving as a facilitator and view the situation through the lens or vision of women of color. In part, this requires allowing that vision to alter how the organizer views her own work and sharing that new information with others who hope to organize and work in communities of color. When organizing with low-income women in a housing project, one of the authors of this chapter initially attempted to separate individual from community concerns. She believed at first that group members would work on individual problem resolution for 8 weeks, and then, having established a pattern of interaction within the group, would be able to work cooperatively on analysis and resolution of community concerns. It became clear within the first 2 meetings that the group could not separate and sequentially work with individual and community concerns. As one participant put it, in quotes, "My individual problems are the community problems," end quote. The flexibility to alter the design based on the realities of the community allowed the group to continue working toward resolution of its identified goals, not those of facilitator researcher. This example illustrates the importance of understanding the community's vision of reality and the process of praxis or action based on critical reflection to unravel and address the salient historical and political forces at work. In the preceding example, had the outside organizer insisted on separating the individual from the community problem, she would have alienated and probably lost committed community activists for whom this separation was artificial and appropriate. By respecting the community's vision of the intimate interdependence of these levels, however, she was able to facilitate a process through which participants proceeded to make the change on both the individual and community levels. Lewis and Ford, 1990. Organizers also use the process of practice to understand and address the historical, political, and social context of the organizing effort. This means that the organizing process, as well as the outcome, will inform both the organized community and the community of the organizer. As organizers and community groups analyze the process and outcome of organizing efforts, the outcome of a tactic often emerges as less important than what the community and organizer learn about the nature of the problem being addressed. In this way, community issues are often redefined. Freire, 1970, and Lewis, 1993. The involvement of women of color in the battered women's movement nicely illustrates this example. When many feminist shelters observed that they were unsuccessful in reaching women of color, they defined the problem as inadequate outreach. When this outreach was unsuccessful, women of color in some localities informed many shelter programs that their approach was alienating and foreign to communities of color. They often identified the lack of women of color in administrative or permanent staff positions as one way in which the program indicated a lack of commitment to their community. Programs that have been most successful with women of color have been those that address their own racism, classism, and ethnocentrism in the development of alternative problems. Schechter, 1982. Participating in the women's ethnic community is an important step for educating the organizer and building bridges for future work. This participation can result in an analysis of societal institution, including the one represented by the organizer, and how they might ultimately benefit or hurt the community. Churches, community centers, schools, and social clubs can be avenues for reaching women of color and affecting change within the community. Knowledge can also be gained about specific communities of color through reading and participation in community events. Faulkner and Capacci, 1988. Particularly for an organizer who is not an ongoing member of the community of women with whom she will be working, developing an understanding of the community's cultural context is vital. In an effort to become involved in the community, one organizer participated in activities sponsored by the local community center. She worked for several months in enrichment programming for the children of the community before proceeding to work with the women. During this time, she became aware of community members' patterns of interaction, their relationships with agencies in the city, and other potential issues in the community. Community members and group participants had the opportunity to meet and talk with the community worker and watch her interact with the children. Many of the initial participants in subsequent organizing efforts later mentioned that their decision to participate in the work was directly related to their approval of the facilitator's work with their children and the nature of her presence in the community. Lewis and Ford, 1990. Effective organizing often begins with the formation of small groups. The small group provides the ideal environment for exploring the social and political aspects of personal problems and developing strategies for work towards social change. Gutierrez, 1990, Hyde, 1994, Purnell, 1985, Schechter et al., 1985. It can also be a forum for identifying common goals among diverse groups of women. The latter strategy involves organizing small groups of individuals to work on specific problems and later coordinating these small groups so they can work in coalition with others on joint issues. On the community level, the small group or house meeting strategy has been the primary way in which women of color have been organizing movements to improve conditions in ghettos and barrios. Hirsch, 1991, Mothers Group, 1989, Fighting Back, 1988. For example, Clementine Barfield's work with Save Our Sons and Daughters in Detroit began with discussions among Save Our Sons and Daughters in Detroit began with discussions among a small group of mothers who had experienced the loss of a child through a violent death in the inner city. Bates, Rudd, 2001. Building these alliances to develop community efforts can be particularly challenging when they involve more than one ethnic or other group. This is particularly true because the United States remains a highly segregated society in which many people experience little meaningful interaction with those outside their own race, class, ethnic group, or sexual orientation. Effective organizing across diverse groups requires breaking down societal boundaries to build alliances. Furthermore, it necessitates recognizing and embracing the conflict that characterizes cross-cultural work. Conflicts will inevitably arise both within those organizations that have been successful in reaching a diverse group and between the organization and a larger community that may be threatened by the absence of expected boundaries. In some respects, the emergence of conflict indicates that meaningful cross-cultural work is taking place. But the sources and resolution of conflict will affect the outcomes of the organizing effort. The extent to which the organizer anticipates conflict related to group interaction, the effects of internalized oppression, wider political strategies to hinder or destroy the community change effort, and similar factors often determines whether or not organizing efforts are successful. Ristock, 1990, West, 1990. Conflict includes the discomfort many organizers feel when they find themselves the sole person from a different ethnic or class background in a group of women of color, or when they attempt to participate for the first time in a community event that has previously been attended solely by persons from the community. It is important for organizers to recognize that they will be tested by community members to determine whether they, like others who came before, are present only to take. Giving on the community's terms, as illustrated in the previous example of the organizer's work with children, is one example of the testing process. In our experience, European American organizers are often less comfortable than women of color with the conflict engendered by the development of a multicultural organization. Conflicts are a part of our everyday lives. They reflect choices about fact, value, and strategy alternatives that we face intra or interpersonally. Lewis, 1988. Too often, women have been socialized into conflict avoidance behaviors. These behaviors only temporarily delay conflicts, which will resurface when issues are not addressed directly. Addressing a conflict has often been misconstrued as synonymous with confrontation, another conflict resolution strategy. They are, however, quite different. Confrontation often means minimizing or attack on a party with which there is conflict. This minimization, either at the personal or political level, can be easily perceived as a threat, which inevitably escalates the conflict rather than creating a dialogue about its nature. Addressing conflict directly means employing interpersonal skills such as engagement, active listening, and consensus building. It means viewing the situation through various lenses in the presence of all who are involved in the conflict, and then managing to reach some consensus about how to proceed. The process of reaching consensus often involves being open about our different conflict styles and managing to hear the content rather than just the affect of the messages being presented. To do so also requires taking a strengths approach. In this case, acknowledging the capacity or strengths in the conflict style of the group with those who have only been privy to one way of handling conflicts. In this way, conflict avoidance techniques may be valued for their ability to offset the attack, whereas confrontation approaches may be valued for their ability to focus immediate attention on the conflict. Conflict resolution that results in genuine dialogue and analysis of the basis of difference will have a direct effect on the outcome of an organizing effort. For example, only after European Americans involved women of color in their organizations did many European American women encounter a different view of gender roles and how they translate into different strategies and goals. Once women of color were included in such organizations, work concerning sexual assault had to recognize and deal with the fears of many European American women concerning men of color. In one organization, it was only after the group began a campaign confronting the myth of the Black rapists that women of color in the organization and the larger community came to believe that the organization represented their needs. Dealing with such conflict is difficult but valuable. If we are to work toward a more equitable society, this vision must be integral to the work of our organizations. We must know ourselves and be open to knowing others. Dealing with community backlash and conflict also requires taking risks to speak out in support of our vision. The inability to resolve these conflicts has resulted in the death of some organizations and minimized our ability to work in coalition. Capacity building. Contemporary organizing by women of color has often taken a grassroots approach based upon existing networks of family, friends, or informal and formal ethnic community institutions. In this way, individual, family, and community interests are viewed as compatible and integrated with one another. Many African American women, Latinas, and other women of color describe themselves as motivated to engage in activism because of their commitment to their communities and ethnic groups. Collins, 2000, Gilks, 1983, Lacayo, 1989. Women have also often been active in the mutual aid societies and ethnic communities, such as the Hui among the Chinese, the Ko among the Japanese, and the tribal councils among Native Americans, Gutierrez and Lewis, 1995. Each of these organizations has served as a vehicle for assisting individual ethnic group members, families, and entire communities in the establishment of business loans, funerals, and community programs. Organizers must recognize and build upon these networks and the myriad ways in which women of color have worked effectively in their own communities. Outside organizers, regardless of their own race or ethnicity, need to work with community leaders and learn from them the most effective ways of working in particular communities. Working with existing leaders may involve organizers in activities that are different from those in which they usually engage. For example, to provide survival services, existing community leaders may be active in church-related activities or with municipal agencies. Bookman and Morgan, 1986. Organizers can learn from these women ways that they have found to survive and leverage political power. Organizers also need to recognize how women of color have been involved in advocating for women's rights since the beginning of the feminist movement. For example, many of the first shelters for battered women were founded by women of color who were responding to the needs in their communities. Schechter, 1982. Recognition of the contributions of women of color to feminist causes can help to break down some of the barriers and difficulties that exist in this work. As already suggested, however, community organizing with women of color may involve a broader perspective than the one initially envisioned by the organizer. This broader perspective recognizes the many ways in which race, gender, class, and ethnicity are intertwined. Consequently, it underscores the impossibility of separating the needs of women from those of their families and communities. Gutierrez and Lewis, 1994. The role of women in the civil rights movements of the 1950s and 1960s certainly illustrates the importance of gender in mobilization efforts. The successful Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott, for example, is usually credited to African American male ministers who were in public leadership positions. But the impetus for the boycott was a group of African American women who impressed on the ministers that the cause was just and they would launch the boycott themselves if the ministers did not take a public stance. The women raised the consciousness of the ministers and in this way contributed significantly to social action. Nevertheless, they were willing to work behind the scenes rather than spearhead the boycott themselves because they thought it was imperative that the African American men's leadership be supported. This delicate interaction of race, ethnicity, class, and gender must be in the forefront of the organizer's praxis perspective. All too often, organizing with women of color has taken the unidirectional outreach approach in which communities of color are targets of change rather than active participants and collaborators. When the former approach is used, women of color often resist organizing efforts and, in some cases, undermine them. Schechter, 1982, Faulkner and Capacci, 1988. It is crucial, therefore, to involve women of color in leadership roles from the onset. Predominantly European American organizations wishing to collaborate with women of color will need to incorporate women of color as leaders and active participants before taking on this kind of work. Such collaboration may require redefining the kind of work the organization does, as well as looking critically at members' attitudes towards institutions such as the church and family. The history of attempts at collaboration suggests that cross-cultural work requires identifying how racism may exclude women of color from leadership roles. Burkhart, 1982, Schechter, 1982. Successful collaboration requires European American organizers to change their interactions with women of color and become capable of sharing power and control of their programs. This type of organizational work embraces a tenet of feminist organizing. Diversity is strength. Issues of perceived or actual social class differences must be taken into account, even when the organizer is from the same ethnic or gender background as the community in which she's working. As noted, the definition of community may be psychological as well as geographic. Those entering or re-entering communities need to recognize that their economic or educational backgrounds may seem to make them somehow different from other community members. They must anticipate suspicion or backlash as a possible consequence. As in other conflict situations, a process of dialogue and action can be used to work through this problem so that the organizer can then participate in the community on its own terms. One of the chapter's authors received a high compliment during a community meeting when she was introduced to others as not an educated fool. One method for building effective coalitions is the incorporation of informal debriefing groups for community workers. These groups include all members of the community and provide opportunities for input and clarification of the organizing process. Those in key leadership positions model their ongoing praxis experiences by being open about the choices made in the organizing effort and the assumptions upon which these choices rest. Debriefing sessions allow community members who are not an integral part of the organizing effort to share additional strategies and evaluate the impact of the design on the community to date. Some groups have used the house meeting strategy to provide debriefing opportunities, whereas others have relied on formal written materials such as community newsletters to keep community members informed. Consistent, ongoing debriefing efforts need to be built into the organizing design and expanded as needed. Within the realm of organizing, there is room for multi-ethnic organizations and cross-ethnic coalitions, but also for organizations developed by and for women of color. In the latter regard, organizers need to understand and support the need that women of color may have for their own separate programs and organizations. For women of color, a separate group or organization in which we can explore who we are in relation to the communities in which we live often creates a vision for future work. Separate organization is one means for building on strengths and nurturing capacity within a community. For example, in work with women of color in an educational setting, the formation of a Women of Color caucus had positive impact on the ability of women's studies programs to hire more faculty of color and develop courses that were more racially and ethnically inclusive. Although the formation was initially viewed by some as divisive, all participants to the program ultimately recognized that the caucus was a critical element in the empowerment of women of color and their capacity to work for positive change for all. And there is a National Association of Black Social Workers, and we do have a local Cleveland State chapter. In conclusion, the chapter has used a framework of education, participation, and capacity building to explore empowering strategies and approaches for community organizing with women of color. Borrowing in part from Rivera and Ehrlich 1995, we have argued that different roles are appropriate for an organizer depending upon her relationship to the community. For example, whether she is a member, a non-member with a similar racial or ethnic background, or a person of a different racial or ethnic group. Regardless of the role played, however, several principles are critical in effective organizing with women of color. These include being an active learner and facilitator who can view a given situation through the lens of women of color, recognizing and embracing the conflict that characterizes cross-cultural work, involving women of color in leadership roles, and in other ways contributing to the building of community capacity. Both feminist perspectives and cultural perspectives on organizing in communities of color offer valuable lessons for organizers who cross race, ethnic, gender, class, and other lines in their organizing efforts. So that is our second article for the week, or maybe it's our first article of the week. I thank you for joining me, and subscribe, Patti Napolitano, social worker, or Factory, which podcast is it? Planting Trees for Future Shade. I have a lot of projects going on right now. So if you subscribe to Patti Napolitano, social worker, you'll be alerted every time I have a lecture, every time I share a therapy tool, anytime I'm doing ASWB exam prep. And if you just want to follow interviews, you can follow the Planting Trees for Future Shade podcast. Thanks.